There is a ruin on a hilltop in western Slovakia where the wind has nothing left to destroy. Countess castle stands above its village the way a tooth stands in a jaw, rooted, functionless, too stubborn to fall. Something happened inside those walls. That much is not in dispute. The trial records survive. They are archived in Budapest and in the Vatican, written in Latin and Hungarian, in hands that shake and hands that do not, and they describe acts of systematic cruelty committed against young women over a period of decades. It is specific in the way that only truth or very careful fabrication can be specific. Distinguishing between the two is the work of this story. The woman at the center of it was born Elizabeth Báthory de Exed in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in the Kingdom of Hungary. For roughly 20 years, according to the testimony of servants, guards, and neighboring villagers, she tortured and killed girls who had been brought to her castles on the promise of employment. The legend says more. The legend always says more. History remembers Elizabeth Báthory as the Blood Countess, a vampire who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, a monster of vanity so absolute that she opened the veins of 600 girls and lowered herself into the warmth. It appears nowhere in the trial records. Not once. The bloodbaths were invented in 1729 by a Jesuit scholar named László Turóczi, who published his account during a continent-wide vampire panic and who cited no source for the claim. The horror, then, is not the legend. The horror is what remains when the legend is removed. Elizabeth Báthory was never tried. Her servants were tried and executed, fingers torn off, then burned alive. She was walled into a set of rooms in her own castle by administrative order, without a verdict, without a sentence, without being permitted to speak in her own defense. The most notorious killer in European history does not have a confirmed grave. What follows is the story of what she did, what was done to her, and what was done to the truth afterward. The myth is a comfortable horror, a monster explained by the supernatural, contained by the fantastic. The documented reality is worse, not because the bloodbaths were real, because they were not necessary. In January of 1611, in the castle at Bicsa, a man named János Ejvári sat before a court and began to speak. He was known as Ficsko, a diminutive, almost affectionate nickname, and he had entered Elizabeth Báthory's service at approximately 17 years of age. By the time of his arrest, he had spent the better part of a decade inside the machinery of what the court would eventually charge as 80 specific murders. His testimony, preserved in the Hungarian National Archives and partially translated by Tony Thorne in 1997, is not the testimony of a man in anguish. It is the testimony of an administrator. He lists names, he lists methods, he lists seasons. He describes holding girls down. He describes disposing of bodies. He describes telling new arrivals what to expect. The girls were young. They were mostly servants, drawn from poor families in the surrounding countryside, brought to Countess or Sava or Kerestor on the promise of employment in a noble household. What they found was a system, not an episode. A system with roles and schedules and implements that were stored in specific places and used by specific hands. Ficsko was one of those hands. He held, he carried, he buried. He was not, by any surviving account, troubled by the work while it was happening. He described it with the fluency of someone recounting the operation of a mill. The methods. They must be named because the naming is the evidence. Testimony collected from dozens of unrelated witnesses across 2 rounds of depositions. January and May of 1611, the latter involving 306 individual depositions, describes the same methods with a convergence that cannot be explained by collusion alone. beatings with rods and clubs, iron pincers applied to the flesh of the arms, the face, the breasts, keys heated in fire until they glowed, then pressed against the skin, needles driven under the fingernails, a method described so frequently and by so many witnesses that it emerges as something like a signature, burning with candle flames and heated coins, starvation prolonged over days, and the cold. Multiple witnesses describe a practice that came to be called star-kicking, girls stripped naked and forced into the castle courtyard in winter, doused with cold water, left in the snow until their bodies stopped. This method is specific to someone with access to a walled courtyard and to the particular cruelty of a Central European winter. It is seasonal murder, something planned around weather, requiring patience, space, and the certainty that no one would intervene. Several witnesses described the same courtyard. Several described the same time of year. The convergence is not the product of a single narrative imposed from above. It is the residue of something that happened in the same place, in the same way, over and over, for years. Fitzko did not act alone, and neither did Elizabeth. The court at Bitcher tried 4 individuals, Fitzko, Dorothea Semtesh, known as Dorka, Ilona Jo, and Katarina Benica. Dorka and Ilona Jo were older women who had served the Countess for years and who functioned, according to testimony, as enforcers, handlers, and procurers. They selected girls. They supervised punishment. They cleaned the rooms afterward. Their presence in the record complicates the story in a way that the legend never does. This was not a lone predator in a tower. It was a household operation with a division of labor maintained across years by multiple participants who understood their roles with the clarity of servants managing any other estate function. Dorka and Fitzko received the most extreme sentences the court could devise. Their fingers were torn from their hands before they were burned alive. Katarina Benica, whom the court judged to have acted under coercion, was imprisoned for life. Whether that distinction reflected an actual moral boundary or a pragmatic decision about which witnesses could still be useful is not clear from the record. But the most disturbing element in the testimony is not any single act of violence. It is the quiet around it. Servants who worked in the castle, not participants, not accomplices, but the ordinary staff who cooked and cleaned and carried wood, describe hearing screaming from locked rooms as a routine feature of life at Nashtis. Not an emergency, not an anomaly, a feature. Girls brought to serve the Countess were warned by other servants, obey instantly, never be alone with her, do not attract attention. At least one witness testified that parents in the surrounding villages had been warned not to send their daughters for service at the castle. The knowledge was local and diffuse and had been circulating for years, possibly decades, before Thurzo's men arrived. A community-wide open secret, carried in whispers from servant to servant, from mother to daughter, from one poor family to the next, and never spoken aloud to anyone with the authority to act on it. No one with authority chose to act. The horror is not that one woman was capable of this. The horror is that her capacity was absorbed into the ordinary functioning of a noble household, the way drought or taxation or the Ottoman raids were absorbed, as a fact of the landscape, terrible and unchangeable, something to be endured or avoided but never confronted. The screaming was background noise. The disappearances were local arithmetic. The stone walls of Fahdase contained the sound, and the social architecture of feudal Hungary contained the knowledge. There is one more figure in the testimony who demands attention, precisely because she cannot be confirmed. Her name was Darvulia. She is described by several witnesses as a woman from the forest, a healer, a cunning woman, possibly a midwife. The word used in some depositions translates as forest witch. She appears in testimony as a figure of considerable influence over Elizabeth beginning in the 1590s. Several witnesses attribute the introduction or escalation of specific practices to Darvulia's guidance, as though the Countess had been tutored in cruelty by an outside specialist, a consultant in methods of pain. Darvulia reportedly died around 1609, just before Thurzo's investigation began. She was never named as a defendant. She was never charged. Her existence cannot be confirmed from any source outside the trial depositions themselves. She may have been real. A woman of the forest, a healer who crossed into something else, who recognized in Elizabeth a client whose appetites could be shaped and supplied. Or she may have been a narrative device, introduced by witnesses who needed to explain how a noblewoman of the highest rank could have arrived at such methods without external corruption. In 17th century Hungary, supernatural causation was neither fringe nor implausible. It was a standard explanatory framework, one that served specific legal functions in a proceeding designed to condemn. To say she was bewitched was to offer a mechanism. It was, in its own way, a mercy, a way of preserving the belief that nobility and monstrosity could not coexist in a single will without outside intervention. Whether Darvulia was a real instigator or a convenient ghost, her presence in the testimony illuminates something about the limits of what the court was willing to believe about its own social order. One final detail. It concerns what is absent. Nowhere in the January 1611 trial, nowhere in the 306 depositions of May 1611, nowhere in Thurzo's correspondence or his memorandum to the emperor, nowhere in Elizabeth's own surviving letters or the testimony of her children or the legal disputes that followed her imprisonment. Nowhere in any document produced by anyone who was alive when she was alive does any witness describe bloodbathing. No vampiric ritual, no youth preservation scheme, no mirror, no vanity, no occult ceremony involving the blood of virgins. The crimes described in the testimony are human, physical, specific. Iron and fire and cold water and the sound of a girl screaming in a locked room while someone on the other side of the wall continued setting the table for dinner. The supernatural layer will come later. It will be added by other hands in another century, for reasons that have nothing to do with what happened at Mestice and everything to do with what Europe needed Elizabeth Báthory to be. But before the supernatural, before the myth, and before the trial, and before the raid, before the locked rooms and the testimony and the bodies in the orchard, there was a family. Elizabeth Báthory was born on August the 7th, 1560, at Nyabata in the eastern reaches of Royal Hungary. Her parents were György Báthory and Anna Báthory, the surname repeated on both sides because the family married within itself, consolidating power along bloodlines that doubled back like corridors in a house with too few doors. She entered a dynasty whose branches held thrones. Her cousin Stephen Báthory had been King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Another cousin, Sigismund Báthory, was Prince of Transylvania. The family maintained estates across Hungary, Transylvania, and into the Holy Roman Empire. Landholdings so vast that they constituted not merely wealth but territory, not merely influence but sovereignty in all but formal title. The family motto was Leges sine moribus vanae. Laws without morals are useless. Consider that motto. Hold it against what follows. A family that inscribed moral philosophy into its heraldry while producing, across 3 generations, a documented pattern of violence, instability, and impunity that contemporaries noted and no institution corrected. Elizabeth's brother Stefan Báthory had a recorded history of sexual violence against peasant girls. He was never charged. Her uncle Gábor Báthory, who would become Prince of Transylvania, governed with such erratic brutality that he was eventually assassinated by his own allies, but not before years of rule in which his excesses were tolerated as the prerogative of rank. The family practiced cousin marriage at rates that drew comment even in an era when noble endogamy was standard. Modern writers have connected this to a pattern of neurological and behavioral disorders across the dynasty, what some have characterized, with anachronistic but not inaccurate language, as inherited predispositions toward violence. This is not an excuse, it is a map of the terrain. Elizabeth did not emerge from silence into monstrosity. She emerged from a family in which monstrosity had a pedigree, a coat of arms, and legal immunity. The legal architecture of Royal Hungary in this period must be understood plainly. Serfdom was codified. The bodies of servants and peasants existed within a framework of noble jurisdiction that granted the landowning class broad latitude to discipline, punish, and dispose of those bound to their estates. A nobleman who beat a serf to death might face social censure from his peers. He would not face prosecution. The system did not recognize the serf's body as bearing the same legal weight as the nobleman's. What Elizabeth is accused of doing was not, in its basic mechanics, categorically different from what dozens of Hungarian noblemen did without consequence in the same decades. The difference, and it is a real difference, one that matters, was scale. Duration. The selection of victims who were not bound serfs but daughters of minor gentry sent to the Countess for education and service. The crossing of that threshold, from peasant bodies to noble ones, is what ultimately made her crimes politically actionable, not the cruelty itself. The cruelty had always been permitted. It was the choice of victim that made the cruelty visible. Her brother Stefan operated within the same system and was never touched. Multiple prominent Hungarian magnates of the era, men whose names appear in the same correspondence networks as the Báthory family, are documented in contemporary sources as committing comparable violence against their household servants. None were investigated, none were raided. The question of why Elizabeth specifically was brought down while her male relatives and peers escaped scrutiny for equivalent acts is not an afterthought. It is structurally central to the case. It does not absolve her. It locates her within a system that punished selectively, and that selected her for reasons that were not purely moral. Into this family, this system, this architecture of permitted cruelty, enter Ferenc Nadasdy. She was betrothed to him in 1571. She was 11 years old. They married in 1575, when she was 14 or 15. He was called the Black Knight of Hungary, a title earned on the Ottoman frontier where his brutality against Turkish prisoners was celebrated as patriotism. Contemporary chronicles describe him nailing Ottoman captives to stakes, flaying captured soldiers, and engaging in what would now be classified as systematic torture of prisoners of war, acts that made him a national hero. His violence was not hidden. It was the source of his reputation, his political standing, his value to the crown. He also left documents. Ritter von Ellsberg, writing in 1894 in Des Blutrefin, describes what he calls Nadasdy's recipes, detailed written memoranda on methods of punishing disobedient servants. These notes survived in family papers. They describe specific techniques. Their tone, as reported by von Ellsberg, is instructional, procedural. The language of a man who considered the disciplining of servants a craft with methods worth recording and transmitting. The line between what those memoranda describe, the legally permitted punishment of serfs by a Hungarian nobleman, and what Elizabeth is accused of in the 1611 testimony, is not a bright line of cruelty. Both involve physical violence against people who cannot resist or escape. The distinction is one of intent, duration, and the identity of the victim. Ferenc beat servants as discipline. Elizabeth, according to testimony, beat them as something else, as practice, as appetite, as an activity undertaken for its own purposes rather than as correction. But the methods overlap. The instruments overlap. The household in which both operated was the same household. This is the framing that historians call the workshop inheritance. The idea that Elizabeth received from her husband not only disposition but methodology, that the culture of Nadasdy's household, with its documented tolerance for extreme physical punishment, its written protocols for inflicting pain, its normalization of violence as an administrative function, provided both the tools and the permission structure for what she would later do alone. That she inherited a workshop already equipped for cruelty, and that after his death, she continued to use it, and then expanded its operations beyond anything he had documented or perhaps intended. This framing is disturbing because it is plausible. It is also contested. Feminist historians, most notably in the revisionist Hungarian scholarship of the 1980s and 1990s, have argued that the workshop inheritance narrative performs a specific ideological function. It explains female violence as derivative of male violence. It makes Elizabeth a student rather than an author. It preserves the comforting assumption that a woman's cruelty must have an external male origin, that she could not have arrived at these methods through her own will, her own intelligence, her own appetite. Both framings deserve to be inhabited. The evidence supports neither exclusively. What is established beyond interpretive dispute is this: Ferenc Nadasdy maintained a household in which brutal punishment was normalized, documented, and never questioned by any external authority.
He died on January 4th, 1604 at Sava Castle.
Elizabeth was 43 years old. She was now a widow, one of the wealthiest in Hungary, managing enormous estates without a male protector, without the social anchor that a living husband of military fame provided. The testimony gathered in 1611 places the alleged intensification of violence after 1604. Multiple witnesses date the escalation, the increase in frequency, the shift in victim profile, the growing recklessness, to the years following Ferenc's death. The causal mechanism is interpretive. Perhaps his presence had been a restraining influence. Perhaps his death removed a social shield that had made her untouchable, and in the absence of that shield she became both more vulnerable to eventual prosecution and more isolated in ways that permitted the violence to accelerate unchecked. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. What is not interpretive is the timing. The husband who documented punishment as craft died. The widow who allegedly practiced punishment as compulsion was alone. And for 6 years, from 1604 to 1610, no one with authority intervened. The family business continued, under new management. The man who ended her was not a crusader, he was a politician. György Thurzo was born in 1567, 7 years after Elizabeth, into a family whose wealth derived not from ancient bloodline, but from strategic marriage, Protestant conviction, and an instinct for positioning that bordered on the architectural. By 1609, he had risen to the office of Palatine of Hungary, appointed by Emperor Rudolf II, confirmed by the Diet, the highest official in the kingdom after the king himself. He commanded armies. He adjudicated disputes among the great families. He managed the delicate, dangerous balance between Habsburg Catholic authority and the Protestant Hungarian nobility, whose loyalty was conditional and whose patience was thin. He was, by every account, intelligent, calculating, and acutely aware that power in royal Hungary was not a throne. It was a ledger. Elizabeth Báthory was his relative by marriage. Their families had intermarried in the way that all great Hungarian houses intermarried, not out of affection but out of the recognition that alliance was survival. Thurzo knew Elizabeth. He knew her estates. He knew almost certainly what the local population knew and had known for years, that girls who entered Szachty's castle did not always come out. He knew and he waited. He waited until 1610, 6 years after Ferenc's death, 6 years during which the testimony would later establish that the violence had accelerated. He waited until the moment was useful. What Thurzo stood to gain was not abstract. Elizabeth's estates constituted one of the largest private landholdings in royal Hungary, accumulated across generations of Nádasdy military service to the crown, spread across modern-day Slovakia and western Hungary, encompassing castles, villages, agricultural land, and the labor of thousands of serfs. As Palatine, Thurzo was uniquely positioned to manage and to benefit from any legal reorganization of those holdings. Elizabeth had also borrowed substantial sums from various creditors, including members of the Thurzo circle. Resolving her legal status would settle those debts in directions that were not accidental. There was more. Thurzo was engaged in a broader political project. The quiet, systematic reduction of Catholic magnate power in the Hungarian Diet. Elizabeth's network was Catholic and Habsburg adjacent, her family connections woven through Transylvania and the Polish-Lithuanian borderlands in ways that made her a node in a web Thurzo wanted weakened. Removing her did not merely seize an estate. It removed a piece from a board whose game was being played across decades. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Szachty's castle with armed men. He claimed to have found Elizabeth in the act. He claimed to have discovered bodies, dead and dying girls in the castle, evidence of fresh violence. That evening, he sent a letter to his wife describing the scene in terms that were vivid, specific, and dramatic. The letter is a primary source. It is preserved, translated, reproduced in Tony Thorne's 1997 account. It reads like a man shaken to his core, or like a man who had been composing his account for some time before the event it described. Historians have noted that specific details in Thurzo's December letter do not match the formal depositions taken from witnesses who were present that same night. The divergences are not dramatic. They are subtle and consistent, the kind of inconsistency that does not arise from confusion or the fog of a traumatic evening, but from the gap between a prepared narrative and the unpredictable details of what actually occurred. The letter describes certain conditions that the depositions do not corroborate. The depositions contain details the letter omits. No single discrepancy is damning. The pattern is. This is the point at which the story changes shape. It is no longer a monster narrative. It is a conspiracy narrative, or at least a narrative in which the machinery of justice must be examined with the same skepticism applied to the crimes it claims to prosecute. Thurzo's letter reads, to some scholars, not as the account of a man who stumbled into horror, but as the performance of a man who needed the horror to be legible to an audience. His wife, the emperor, posterity, in a specific way, on a specific timetable. What followed was swift. In January 1611, at Bitcher Castle, Elizabeth's 4 accused accomplices were tried: Fitchco, Dorka, Ilona Jo, and Katerina Benica. Fitchco and Dorka were sentenced to have their fingers torn off with hot pincers before being burned alive. Ilona Jo received the same sentence. Benica, deemed to have acted under coercion, was imprisoned. The trial was real. The sentences were carried out. Elizabeth was not tried. This is the most legally anomalous fact in the entire case, and it deserves to be sat with. A woman accused of the serial murder of dozens, possibly hundreds, of young women was never brought before a court, never confronted with the testimony against her, never permitted to speak in her own defense. Her servants were tried, convicted, and executed in a matter of days. She was imprisoned by administrative order, without verdict, without sentence, without a single formal legal proceeding in which she was named as a defendant. Thurzo's memorandum to Emperor Matthias II, who had succeeded Rudolf, explains the decision in terms that are revealing precisely because they do not attempt to be. He argues against a formal trial on explicit grounds. It would bring shame upon the noble families into which Elizabeth's children had married. Her daughter Anna had married Miklos Zrinyi. Her daughter Katalin had married Georgi Drugeth. These were Protestant houses, Thurzo's own political allies. A public trial of Elizabeth Báthory would drag their names through proceedings that would become a spectacle across Europe. The memorandum frames this as protection of the innocent, the children, the grandchildren, the family honor. But protection of whom? The children whose inheritances would be preserved if their mother was silenced rather than tried. The families whose connections to a convicted serial murderer would be politically ruinous. The Palatine himself, whose role in assembling the evidence, conducting the raid, and managing the outcome might not survive the scrutiny of cross-examination in an imperial court. The answer is probably all of them. Thurzo's memorandum, translated in Kimberly Craft's 2009 account, is the document of a man who has constructed an outcome and needs it ratified, not examined. The emperor agreed. Elizabeth was walled into rooms at Fasti. The case was closed by being sealed shut, literally and procedurally. The historiographical split that follows from this is deep and unresolved. Those who take Thurzo at face value, and there are serious scholars among them, argue that he acted within the constraints available to him. He could not execute a Countess of the Báthory line without a full imperial proceeding that would have taken years, cost a fortune, and destabilized the Hungarian Diet. Imprisonment was the pragmatic solution to a genuine horror. He stopped the killing. He did what the system permitted. The revisionists tell a different story. László Nagy, in Say a Rosszhira Bathoyak, published in 1984, untranslated from Hungarian, summarized in English by Katalin Péter in the 1988 Hungarian Historical Review, argues that Thurzo orchestrated a frame-up, or at minimum took genuine but limited abuse and amplified it into a capital-grade atrocity sufficient to justify the seizure of one of the largest estates in the kingdom. Irma Sadecki Kardos, across multiple articles in Hungarian language journals, has pressed the same argument from different angles, that the scale of the charges was manufactured, that the witness testimony was coerced or guided, that the number of victims was inflated by a prosecution that needed the crime to be enormous because the prize was enormous. The evidence does not permit resolution. What the evidence permits is something worse than certainty. A vertigo in which the reader, the viewer, the historian, cannot determine whether the person who stopped the monster was himself monstrous. whether the investigation that ended the killing was itself a different kind of predation, whether the machinery of justice, having finally moved not because the screaming grew too loud, but because the estates grew too valuable to leave in the hands of a woman no one could control. Thurzo died in 1616, 2 years after Elizabeth, still in power, still in possession of the arrangements he had made. His heirs benefited. Her children inherited what remained. The servants who had been executed stayed dead. The girls who had died at Mástisy stayed buried in orchards and cellars and churchyards whose locations were recorded in testimony and then, over the centuries, forgotten. The man who caught her got everything he wanted. Whether he also caught the truth is a question the documents cannot answer, because the documents were his. (650). It is the number most people know. It is the number that placed Elizabeth Báthory in the Guinness World Records as the most prolific female murderer in history. It is cited in encyclopedias, true crime anthologies, horror documentaries, and popular histories with the confidence of established fact. And it comes from a single source, one witness in one deposition, referencing one document that has not been seen by any living person for more than 400 years. The witness was Elizabeth Báthory, deposed during the January 1611 proceedings at Bitcher. Her testimony, translated in Kimberly Craft's 2009 infamous Lady, the most complete English-language rendering of the trial record, claims that Elizabeth kept a register, a ledger or diary written in her own hand in which she recorded the names of her victims. Báthory states that this register contained 650 names. She does not say she read it herself. She does not describe where she saw it or when. She reports its existence as something known, the way one reports a rumor that has hardened through repetition into certainty. That register is not in the Hungarian National Archives. It is not in the Vatican archive. It is not among the Thurzo family papers. It is not in any private collection that has been catalogued or searched. It was reportedly in Thurzo's possession after the December 1610 raid, taken, presumably, as evidence. It then passed, according to some accounts, to his son. After that, nothing. The most important single piece of evidence in the case, the one document that could establish or refute the scale of the killings with specificity, has been missing since the 17th century. It may have been destroyed. It may never have existed. The difference between those two possibilities is the difference between a cover-up and a fabrication, and the evidence does not permit us to distinguish between them. Consider what we are left with. A number, attributed to a document, referenced by a single witness, under conditions of testimony that, as the revisionists have documented, was shaped by an investigator with financial and political motives to maximize the severity of the charges. The number 650 may be accurate. It may be what Elizabeth wrote. It may also be what someone told Elizabeth Báthory to say, or what Báthory believed she had heard from someone who had heard it, from someone who had seen the register, or what Báthory inferred from the scale of the operation she had witnessed over years. We do not know. We cannot know. The document that could tell us is gone. Strip the legend away. Read only the depositions, the testimony of direct witnesses, the accounts of people who describe specific deaths they witnessed or specific bodies they saw. The picture that emerges is smaller but no less devastating. Fichko, Janos Báthory, the manservant who had spent nearly a decade as Elizabeth's facilitator, provides specific body counts in his deposition, translated in Tony Thorne's 1997 Countess Dracula. He names victims, he describes seasons, locations, methods. His testimony, taken alongside the corroborating accounts of other direct witnesses, supports a range of approximately 30 to 80 victims. The court itself, in its formal judgment, charged Elizabeth's servants with 80 specific murders. This is the legally established flaw, the number the prosecution was willing to commit to under the procedural constraints of a formal proceeding. 80, not 650, but 80 girls, 80 young women whose lives ended in that castle, whose bodies were carried down back stairs and buried in orchards and churchyards and cellar floors, is not a small number. It is not a number that requires inflation to establish horror. It is an enormity, The distance between 80 and 650 is not the distance between innocence and guilt. It is the distance between a crime and a legend. The inflation to 650 was not necessary to establish that something terrible happened at Countess. It was necessary only to establish that what happened there was unprecedented, singular, beyond the scale of ordinary noble violence. It was necessary, perhaps, because ordinary noble violence was not illegal, and Thurzo needed something extraordinary to justify extraordinary measures. If the register existed, if Elizabeth Báthory truly kept a written record of the people she killed, what was it? 3 possibilities, each with its own architecture of horror. The first is administrative logic. The killing was sufficiently systematic and integrated into the operations of the estate that it was tracked the way other household functions were tracked: provisioning, staffing, expenditure. A line in a ledger, a name, a date, perhaps a notation. Murder as bookkeeping. The normalization so complete that the act of recording was not confession but inventory. This is the possibility that forensic historians find most plausible and most disturbing, not because it makes Elizabeth more monstrous, but because it makes the household around her more complicit. A register implies a system. A system implies that others knew, participated, facilitated, that the killing was not hidden, but merely unspoken. The second is trophy behavior. Forensic psychologists who have examined the case, working, necessarily, from 400-year-old depositions rather than direct clinical observation, identify documentation as consistent with a specific serial killer typology. The killer who records, who revisits the record, who possesses the victim a second time through the act of writing the name. This is the explanation that satisfies the true crime framing. Elizabeth as a recognizable psychological profile, her register as evidence of the compulsive, ritualistic quality of her violence. It may be true. It is also, conveniently, the explanation that makes the best story. The third is fabrication. The register was compiled after the fact, by Thurzo's agents, or by someone in his employ, and attributed to Elizabeth as manufactured evidence. A list of names assembled from parish records, from complaints, from the testimony of witnesses who were asked to name every girl they had ever known to enter the castle and not return. 650 is a large number. It is also a suspiciously round number. It is the kind of number produced by estimation, not enumeration. If someone were fabricating a document to justify the seizure of one of the largest estates in Hungary, they would need a number large enough to preclude mercy. 650 precludes mercy. The earth at Countess has been asked to testify. It has refused. The Slovak Cultural Ministry conducted archaeological surveys of the castle grounds in 1988 and again in 2007, referenced in Z. Saltbaggy's 2008 study. The results are inconclusive in the specific way that makes certainty impossible. Fragmentary human remains were found in the castle grounds. They could not be dated with precision. They could not be attributed to the Báthory period with confidence. They could not be systematically enumerated, counted, named, restored to personhood. The bones are there. They do not speak. They do not confirm a number. The orchards where witnesses described nighttime burials have been replanted, dug over, built upon for 4 centuries. The churchyards where bodies were reportedly interred contain the remains of entire communities layered over generations. The cellars of the castle have partially collapsed. No full excavation has ever been conducted. No systematic forensic investigation of the kind that might, in principle, establish a victim count through physical evidence rather than testimony. The site has never been treated as a crime scene in the modern forensic sense. It has been treated as a ruin, a tourist attraction, a legend. The ground holds what it holds, and no one with the authority and the funding and the political will has ever committed to reading it fully. We cannot know how many people Elizabeth Báthory killed. The number 650 comes from a document no one can produce, referenced by a witness whose reliability cannot be assessed, in a proceeding controlled by a man with a motive to maximize the count. The number 80 comes from a formal legal charge, more credible, more grounded, but assembled by the same compromised machinery. The physical evidence has never been fully gathered. The site has never been fully searched. The one document that might resolve the question has been missing for 4 centuries, and its absence is itself suspicious, because if it confirmed the charges, Thurzo had every reason to preserve it, and if it contradicted them, he had every reason to destroy it. The number is the hole at the center of the case. It is the place where evidence should be and is not. Everything else, the testimony, the politics, the legend, the myth, orbits that absence. 650, a figure that floats untethered to any surviving document, unconfirmed by any excavation, unsupported by any independent verification. A number written on a page that no one can find, in a hand that no one can authenticate, in a register that may never have existed outside the courtroom testimony of a single woman speaking under conditions we cannot fully reconstruct. The certainty of a statistic. And beneath it, nothing. Elizabeth Báthory died on August 24, 1614, face down on the floor of her sealed chamber. Her family arranged a burial, first at Nácstís, then relocated after local objections to the Báthory crypt at Nyírbátor, and then, for more than a century, silence. The case remained a regional memory. The noble families who had been implicated, embarrassed, enriched, or damaged by the affair had no interest in its revival. The Thurzo family held the estates. The Báthory children married well and said nothing. The dead stayed buried, unnamed, uncounted, unmourned in any public record. For 115 years, Elizabeth Báthory was not a legend. She was an incident, filed away in archives that no one outside the Hungarian legal establishment had reason to consult. What transforms a historical atrocity into a continental myth is not the passage of time. It is collision. The moment when an old story meets a new fear, and the fear gives it a shape the original facts never possessed. The fear arrived in 1726. It arrived not as folklore but as official correspondence, military reports, clinical documentation. In the Serbian village of Medveja, within the Habsburg military frontier, a soldier named Arnold Paula died after falling from a hay wagon. He had told neighbors during his life that he had been troubled by a vampire in the old country, that he had visited the creature's grave, eaten earth from it, smeared himself with its blood, and believed himself contaminated. Within weeks of Paula's burial, villagers began dying. The community was certain Paula had risen. He was feeding. What happened next was not superstition operating in isolation. It was superstition validated by the machinery of empire. Habsburg military officials, regimental field surgeon Johann Flückiger among them, were dispatched to investigate. They exhumed Paula's corpse 40 days after burial. They found it, they reported, uncorrupted. Fresh blood at the mouth, skin peeling to reveal new growth beneath. They drove a stake through the body. It groaned. Flückinger's report, the Visum et Repertuma of 1732, though documenting events that began in 1726, was submitted through military channels, reached Vienna, and was published. The word vampire entered German and French print for the first time. Within months, the report had been reprinted, translated, excerpted, sensationalized. Pamphlets proliferated across the German-speaking world, then France, then England. The vampire was no longer a peasant superstition confined to Slavic borderlands. It was a clinical finding, attested by imperial physicians, stamped with the authority of Habsburg bureaucracy. The panic spread. Between 1726 and 1732, multiple communities across Serbia, Wallachia, and Moldavia conducted formal exhumations. Bodies were staked, burned, decapitated, with official sanction, documented in government records. The Empress Maria Theresa eventually dispatched her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate and debunk the phenomenon. He did so in 1755. But by then the damage, or rather the creation, was complete. Europe had its monster. The vampire was institutional, literary, continental. It was into this atmosphere, precisely into the center of this panic, that a Jesuit scholar named László Turóczi published a book in 1729. The book was titled Tragica Historiae. It was a compendium of notable Hungarian crimes and curiosities written in Latin, aimed at an educated readership. Turóczi was working from manuscript sources about the Báthory case, sources that no longer survive in their original form. He had access to some version of the trial record, or at minimum to summaries of it. He reproduced some factual details about the case that are verifiable against the surviving archival documents, and then he added something that appears nowhere in those documents. Elizabeth Báthory, Turóczi wrote, had bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. He does not cite a source for this claim. He does not attribute it to a specific witness, a specific document, a specific date. It simply appears, presented as historical fact, unsupported by any reference to the 1611 proceedings. The claim is structurally identical to the folklore circulating in the vampire panic pamphlets of Turóczi's own decade. The idea that fresh human blood possesses rejuvenating properties, that the undead feed to sustain an unnatural vitality. Turóczi was a Jesuit with a political and religious agenda, writing during a period of counter-Reformation assertion in Hungary for an audience already saturated with stories of blood and immortality. He gave them what they were primed to receive. This is the origin. The most famous thing about Elizabeth Báthory, the single detail that every person who has heard her name believes they know, was invented here, in this book, by this man, in this year. It is law. It has no documentary foundation in any source contemporaneous with Elizabeth's life or trial. 67 years later, in 796, a German scholar named Michael Wagner published Beitrag zur philosophischen Anthropologie. Wagner took Turóczi's blood-bathing claim and elaborated it further. He added what has become known as the mirror origin story. Elizabeth, gazing at her reflection, struck a servant girl whose blood spattered upon the Countess's skin. Seeing the blood on her hand, Elizabeth believed her skin appeared younger where the blood had touched it. From this moment, Wagner claimed, the obsession began. This story appears in no document from 1611, no witness describes it, no letter references it. It is a Romantic-era psychological invention, an attempt to provide the monster with a comprehensible motivation, an origin that an Enlightenment audience could process as pathology rather than pure evil. It is elegant. It is cinematically vivid. It has been repeated in every popular account of Elizabeth Báthory for 230 years. It is not history. It is a story about a mirror, told by a man who was born 182 years after the events he purported to describe. From Turóczi to Wagner to the literary tradition that followed, the blood-bathing Countess entered the permanent architecture of European horror. And from that architecture, she entered the imagination of a man working in London at the end of the 19th century. Bram Stoker's working notes for a Dracula, composed in the early 1890s and preserved today at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, contain references to both Vlad Tepes, the Wallachian prince known as the Impaler, and to the Countess Báthory. The structural elements are unmistakable: the aristocratic predator, the ancient castle, the obsession with blood as a medium of immortality, the Eastern European geography, the collision of modernity with an ancient and noble evil. These elements flow directly from the Báthory legend as transmitted through Turóczi and Wagner, not from the historical record of her trial, which Stoker almost certainly never consulted, but from the mythologized version that had circulated for a century and a half. Elizabeth Báthory is, with high probability, the historical foundation of the vampire as Western literature knows it. The blood, the castle, the Countess, the youth preserved through murder, the aristocratic immunity, the Eastern European darkness. And she was not a vampire. She did not bathe in blood, not according to any witness who was alive when she was. She was not associated with the supernatural during her lifetime, except in the generic witchcraft accusations that were standard legal currency in her era. She was a woman who tortured other women in rooms that still partly stand, for reasons that the surviving evidence cannot fully explain. The myth took the human horror, specific, documented, resistant to easy narrative, and replaced it with something supernatural, something containable, something that could be enjoyed as fiction, marketed as entertainment, reduced to a costume, a film poster, a Halloween mask. The geography confirms what the literary genealogy suggests. Actisi Castle, the site of the historical crimes, sits approximately 200 kilometers from the border of Transylvania, where Stoker would place his fictional count, the same Carpathian hills, the same Habsburg frontier between Christendom and the Ottoman south, the same fog, the same forests, the same roads that carried merchants and soldiers and stories between the two regions for centuries. The real monster and the invented one occupy not merely the same metaphorical territory, the aristocrat who feeds on the powerless, but the same physical landscape. The same mountains held them both. The myth was born in 1729 in a book by a Jesuit scholar during a continent-wide panic about the dead who would not stay buried. It was elaborated in 1796 by a philosopher who needed the monster to have a mirror. It reached its final form in 1897 in a novel by an Irishman who had never visited the Carpathians. At each stage, the historical woman receded further, replaced by something grander, simpler, more satisfying to an audience that preferred its evil supernatural. What was lost in the transformation was not innocence. Elizabeth Báthory was not innocent. What was lost was specificity. The names of the dead, the texture of the rooms, the machinery of impunity that allowed decades of murder to proceed unchecked. The vampire needs no political explanation. The vampire has no enablers, no system, no complicit silence. The vampire is singular, supernatural, and ultimately defeatable. The historical Elizabeth Báthory is none of these things. She is human, embedded, systemic, and her story implicates everyone who knew and said nothing. The myth is easier. That is why it survived. In January of 1611, after her servants had been tried and executed at Bitcher, masons were brought to Shakti's castle. They bricked up the entrances to a set of rooms, typically described as two, on an upper floor. They cut narrow slots into the stone for the passage of food and air. When the mortar dried, Elizabeth Báthory ceased to exist. There was no sentence. There was no verdict. There was no trial. György Thurzó's memorandum to Emperor Matthias had argued against a formal proceeding on the grounds that it would bring shame to the noble families into which her children had married. The emperor, who had wanted a public execution, was overruled by political convenience. The compromise was erasure. Elizabeth would not be killed because killing a countess required a legal mechanism that would expose too many adjacent interests. She would not be freed because the testimony, however compromised, described horrors that could not be publicly forgiven. She would simply be sealed away, removed from the world of law and title and consequence, as though she had never been. She was 50 years old. The rooms were not a dungeon. They were chambers in her own castle, in the building she had managed for decades, where she had raised her children and conducted the business of one of the largest estates in royal Hungary. The walls that enclosed her were walls she had walked past 1,000 times. The slot through which her meals arrived opened onto corridors she had once commanded. The architecture of her imprisonment was the architecture of her former life, reduced to its most minimal terms. A room, a wall, an opening, the width of a hand. What survived from those sealed chambers is sparse, and for that reason, strange. A will dictated in 1614, a few months before her death, divides her estates among her children. The document exists in the Hungarian National Archives. It is written in the language of property law, business-like, specific, competent. It makes no mention of the trial. It does not name her accusers. It does not acknowledge her imprisonment. She writes as though she is a free woman disposing of her holdings in the ordinary way, as though the wall is not there, as though the slot is not the only aperture between her and the world. Whether this reflects genuine composure or profound denial or a calculated performance for the legal record is a question that cannot be answered from the document itself. The will is a surface. It tells us what she wanted her children to inherit. It tells us nothing about what she thought, alone, in a room that had no door. Letters she reportedly dictated to her son Pal during the years of her confinement remain in private family archives in Hungary. They have not all been published. From what scholars have reported of their contents, the voice that emerges is not the voice of a broken woman. She continued to manage estate affairs as best she could from behind the wall. She corresponded with her children. She disputed the legal arrangements Thurzo had imposed over her property, arrangements she regarded as illegitimate, imposed by a man she considered her political enemy rather than her judge. The tone, by all accounts, is that of someone who believes she is waiting out a temporary problem, a political difficulty that would, in time, resolve itself. The wall would come down, the slot would widen into a door. The men who had done this to her would lose their influence, and she would resume her life. The wall did not come down. On the evening of August 24, 1614, a soldier assigned to guard the sealed rooms wanted to see the woman inside. The historical record, preserved in the account cited by Kimberly Craft, describes his motive with a single phrase: he wished to look at the notorious woman. He peered through the slot. Elizabeth Báthory was lying face down on the stone floor. She was dead. She had eaten her evening meal. There was no record of illness. No physician was summoned to examine the body, or if one was, no report survives. The cause of death was not recorded. She was 54 years old. She had spent the last 4 years of her life in a room with no exit, communicating through a slot in the wall, writing letters and dictating legal documents, and managing what remained of her affairs with the same imperious precision that had characterized her decades of freedom. And then she was face down on the floor, and the slot that had been her only interface with the living world became the aperture through which a curious guard confirmed that she was gone. She was buried first in the church at Fashdis, in accordance with the wishes she had expressed. The villagers of Fashdis objected. The nature of the objection is not fully documented, but its force was sufficient. The body was disinterred and moved to the Báthory family crypt at Neabata, in eastern Hungary, where she had been born 54 years earlier. Whether her remains are still at Neabata is not confirmed. There is no verified grave marker. The crypt has been opened and closed and reorganized over the centuries, and the specific location of her body within it, if it is within it, has not been established by any modern survey. The most notorious killer in European history does not have a known grave. Her children survived. Anna had married Miklos Zrinyi, a nobleman of considerable standing. Katalin had married György Drugeth, Count of Homonia. Pal, her only son, became a minor official, a figure of no particular distinction in the historical record. None of the children were legally penalized. The estates were reorganized under arrangements that benefited Thurzo and the crown. The men who had known about the violence for years, who had heard the rumors, who had employed the same servants, who had attended the same courts, were not charged, were not questioned, were not named in any proceeding. The question of what actually happened at Nyaktis was never formally answered, not because the evidence was insufficient, though it was compromised, not because the accused was too powerful, though she had been. The question was never answered because no one with the authority to answer it wanted it answered. A trial would have required testimony about who else knew. A verdict would have required a legal standard that might have implicated the Palatine's own conduct. A sentence would have required acknowledging that the system that produced Elizabeth Báthory was the same system that produced the men who sealed her away. It was simpler to brick up the room and let the silence do the work. The torture narrative, the testimony from the January trial, the depositions of 300 witnesses, the litany of irons and needles and frozen water is active horror. It moves. It accumulates. It has the terrible momentum of specific acts committed against specific bodies. The walled room is the opposite. It is static. It is slow. It is 4 years of stone and silence, and a slot in a wall through which food arrives and documents depart, and nothing else passes. A woman of colossal rank reduced to a formal inconvenience. A life measured not in acts but in their absence. No visitors, no hearings, no appeals, no voice except the one that dictated letters about property disputes to a son who could not help her. She killed. The evidence supports that conclusion even after every political distortion is accounted for. She killed probably dozens of people, almost certainly with prolonged cruelty, over a period of years in which no one with power chose to intervene. And her punishment was not justice. It was not even vengeance. It was administrative. She was filed away, contained, reduced to a problem that would resolve itself in time, as all biological problems do. The face-down figure on the stone floor. The slot in the wall, still open, admitting the last of the evening light. The guard who wanted to see the notorious woman and saw instead the stillness that had been building in that room for 4 years. The stillness that was, in the end, the only sentence she received. The archive at the Hungarian National Archives in Budapest contains a shelf designation for the Báthory Nádasdy trial records. The shelf is partially occupied. The transcripts from January and May of 1611 are there, bound, catalogued, real. 300 witnesses spoke into the record, and the record held. Beside those transcripts, in the space where a register of 650 names should rest if it ever existed, there is nothing. No ledger, no diary, no list in a steady hand. The shelf simply ends. Whatever was there, if anything was ever there, was removed or destroyed or imagined into being by a single witness whose testimony was taken under conditions no modern court would recognize. The number that defines Elizabeth Báthory in the popular imagination is a number that corresponds to an absence, not a document, a gap. Beside that gap, another. The trial verdict that would have established, under oath and cross-examination, what she did and what was fabricated, that verdict does not exist. She was never tried. The legal proceeding that condemned her servants to death by fire did not extend to her. The Palatine decided. The Crown agreed. The room was bricked. The law, which had already failed the girls who died in that castle, failed one final time by declining to name what had happened to them. Their deaths were entered into evidence not as crimes warranting justice, but as facts warranting a political arrangement. The distinction matters. It is the distinction between a society that punishes murder and a society that manages inconvenience. The grave should be the last fixed point. It is not. Elizabeth Báthory was buried at the church in Countess. The villagers protested. The same villagers who had known for decades, who had sent their daughters anyway, who had said nothing until it was safe to object. The body was moved to the Báthory family crypt at Nyírbátor, 400 kilometers to the east. Whether it arrived, whether it remains, whether the crypt that bears the family name contains the woman who bore it. These are open questions. No marker has been confirmed. No remains have been verified. What remains instead is what was always there. The castle on the hill above the village. The ruin that is not a ruin in the way most ruins are, not a place that fell into disuse and crumbled under weather and neglect. Countess was made into a ruin. It was dismantled in stages after the Báthory scandal, as if the stones themselves were contaminated. The dungeon structure beneath the main hall, the space that corresponds to where the testimony places the rooms where girls were held and hurt and killed, collapsed in the 18th century. Its layout has never been fully excavated. What is beneath it has never been systematically searched. The Slovak Cultural Ministry noted fragmentary human remains in the grounds that could not be dated or attributed. They are still there. Unexcavated, uncounted, unnamed. And then the myth arrived, 115 years later, and it was easier. A woman who bathes in blood is a monster from a story. A woman who beats a servant girl to death with a key heated in a fire and does it again the following week and is not stopped because her title outweighs the girl's life. That woman is not a monster from a story. She is a product of a system. The system survived her. The system sealed her away and kept running. The blood-bathing legend, invented by a Jesuit scholar who never met her and never read the testimony, replaced the real horror with a fairy tale that asked nothing of its audience except a shudder. The shudder became a novel. The novel became a film. The films became 1,000 films. Somewhere beneath the accumulation, the dead girls, the ones who had names, who had families, who arrived at the castle expecting work, disappeared a second time.